An interesting note about these ravens and crows, apart from the fact they sound like dogs, which kind of does get explained later, is that birds in... Oh. Is that birds, and particularly ravens and crows, sparrows as well for some reason, are often seen by... often seen as psychopomps, which is guides to the underworld. And in this sort of multi-layered city and world, in fact, I feel like their placement isn't accidental. I feel like they're always placed around scenes of death and places where there's been a lot of bloodshed. If you listen closely, you can hear the music box. And full disclosure, first time I played through the game, I completely missed that. I missed the entire subquest. I missed the easy way to sort of cheese Father Gascoigne, because I guess I just didn't listen. So let's go and collect these, and we'll talk about the Castle of Otranto. So Horace Walpole, the inventor of a lot of Gothic tropes and almost the codifier of a lot of them in later fiction. He published the Castle of Otranto on Christmas Eve in 1764, and the scholar Tim Pye has described it as containing, he said it's a tale of mistaken identity, supernatural happenings, tense pursuits, and heightened sexuality in the dark. And it's set in a castle, all of which later would obviously become massively associated with Gothic fiction. You think of Gothic fiction, you think of, well, first of all, the architecture, this kind of like these isolated castles, and these spiraling buttresses and all these turrets and everything. How many times have I said buttresses so far? And you do get the sense that it's all because Horace Walpole invented these tropes in the Castle of Otranto back in 1764. Had to glance down at my notes there, and this dog started attacking me. And yeah, he was really the trope codifier of this. He wrote the Castle of Otranto in 2 months. He worked from a dream and wrote for a frenzied 2 months, and he invented a lot of the tropes that we now associate with Gothic fiction, the ones I've mentioned. But it's also notable that that it contains a framing narrative. So it's ostensibly written by it has a foreword ostensibly written by a man who found the manuscript in a castle, a Catholic castle, in fact, because he wanted to appeal to the sort of antiquity of the time, and he wanted to make sure that people didn't associate him with the work, which he saw as a work of entertainment rather than any sort of work of great historical merit. And it opens with, it's bizarre actually. It opens with a guy being crushed by a helmet, which is hundreds of times the size of a regular helmet, and you kind of think, what the fuck is the point of this? But over the course of the novel, all this builds to this theme where we have, that somebody who's not the rightful lord of a place trying to usurp it, and we have sort of these tense chases through underground catacombs, and eventually the castle itself is sort of laid low by this enormous ghost figure. And a lot of it is played almost more for comedy than it is for serious effect. And obviously, as Gothic fiction went on, it would become more and more associated with horror. But it also has, some remarkably forward-facing ideas, some, things that even now you kind of go, okay, that's very laudable. So it has the closest thing it has to a protagonist is this heroine who's trying to escape from the bands of marriage that are being placed on her. And it also has some fantastic visual elements, like the painting of an ancestor flies off the wall and starts chasing one of our, well, I guess nominal heroes around, which is, obviously if you've seen Futurama, you know immediately where my mind went, but it's just an incredible piece of work. And what's really remarkable about it is how closely it hews to modern associations with not just Gothic, but particularly Gothic romance. So if you've ever seen Guillermo del Toro's Crimson Peak, which was sort of incorrectly marketed as being a Gothic, well, not even that, a horror story. When in reality, what it really is I don't know if you can hear that. That's howling. Cleric Beast again, possibly Vicar Amelia. What it really harkens back to is the idea of Gothic romances, which have heroines who are kind of misled, and where there's kind of really spiritual and allegorical nature to all the romances. So I don't want to tangle with those guys. Oh, no. Okay, I very, very nearly shot myself when I saw it coming. But there were other codifiers of Gothic fiction during that time. So you had, and a lot of them, interestingly, were women. And I say that's interesting because later on, a lot of Gothic fiction wouldn't necessarily treat women well. And a lot of Gothic-inspired fiction wouldn't. I mean, hell, a lot of all fiction, a lot of all media doesn't treat women well. So you had the Old English Baron, which was written in 1977 by Clara Reeve. You had The Recess, or A Tale of Other Times, which was written by Sophia Lee. And you had Emmeline, Emmeline, Orphan of the Castle, which was written by Charlotte Smith in 1788. And this was all written over the course of a few years, where everything was heavily inspired by Horace Walpole's Castle of Otranto, which by that point had sort of pervaded national identity and national recognition, nearly fucking died, and got to the point where people felt that they could add to the canon, and these were sort of stories that also helped to codify all those tropes. So a lot of them featured castles, a lot of them featured heroines who were isolated from society by one thing or other. But really, apart from Walpole, the person who in that era really contributed to Gothic fiction was a woman called Anne Radcliffe, who was known as the Mistress of Udolpho after a story she'd written called the Mysteries of Udolpho, set in Italy, which is actually kind of a common trope for a lot of the Gothic fiction of that age. Swing again so I can hit you with this. Nope. And again. Nope. And fuck it, I'll just hit you. Or miss. Oh, I'll miss and die. So that's excellent. Yeah, so a heroine and this kind of association of character with location. So in the Mysteries of Udolpho, her I guess her adoptive father, the protagonist, is he spirits her mother and her away to this castle in Italy, and over the course of the narrative it becomes clear that the association. Did I just lose all my blood echoes? Balls! Alright, time to run back. The association of castle and location with identity becomes ever stronger, to the point where it's almost like she invented the idea of this genius loci, where the nature of a character is reflected in. Oh, there's a thing over there. Is reflected in the place with which you most associate them. But there were other people who around this time started to expand upon the canon of Gothic literature. So you had Matthew Lewis, who wrote The Monk, a fiction, which was explicitly inspired. In a letter to his mother, he wrote that this was heavily inspired by everything Anne Radcliffe did. And she was reportedly horrified by this, because The Monk was this lurid tale of, sexuality and depraved behaviour by a monk, of which she didn't recognise anything that she'd been writing about in her examples of Gothic fiction. She was much more concerned with atmosphere than with gore, than with sensationalism. But because of works like because of works like The Monk by Matthew Lewis, those tropes became very easy to parody. And so we had people like Jane Austen, who would parody Gothic fiction in Northanger Abbey, and just the idea of this kind of tense supernatural tale set in a castle became ripe for satire, which is, it's bizarre when you think about it that it could happen that fast, but there you go. Oh, I'm dead. Yes, and sorry, excuse me, that was just very well done. And then, obviously, as ever, when fiction gets deconstructed through those works, then it got reconstructed through works like Matthew Hogg's Private Memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner, and like Thomas de Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Addict. And the idea of Gothic becoming, or rather Gothic fiction becoming more integral to the English national character, just became more and more accepted, to the point where, has he eaten my souls? Yes, he has, the bastard. to the point where we got really influential and powerful English authors writing about this sort of stuff with an eye on taking it seriously as an art form again. And even though a lot of them, like Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein, regarded it as a trifle, almost as, you know, something that she did for entertainment's sake, much like Horace Walpole did, there were clear echoes of, you know, everything that was integral to Gothic fiction since the start. So if you think about Frankenstein, for instance, then you'll notice that there's a framing narrative there as well, where you sort of it's related through the framing narrative is that of a person who has discovered Victor Frankenstein in the sort of in the wastelands, and who he's relaying his tale to, and you know the association with modern Prometheus harkens back to a lot of those Enlightenment times that people were actively rebelling against, and which she sort of repurposed as integral. You know, she sort of said this stuff still inspired Gothic fiction, even though it was even though it was a I can't think of the word when I find this guy. As much as it was a reaction to that sort of Latinate, old folktale sort of thing, she said it's still inspired by this sort of stuff. But what Frankenstein in particular did was it humanized the characters, the monsters of Gothic fiction. And so towards the time where Dickens was prolific, you got to see Gothic becoming metropolitan. So no longer was it the domain of castles, of rural horror, essentially. Rural horror, by the way, is the scariest type of horror. We're going to get into that when I go to Hemlock Charnel Lane, but I'm so much scared of everything that can happen out in the sticks than I am of things that can happen in the metropolis. I know that there's more people, and therefore there's a lot more opportunities for people to hurt you in metropolitan areas, but something about the idea that these isolated communities can breed and harbour murderers and monsters and everything, it's just a lot scary to me. And I think, did he just fall through the world? And I think that's best illustrated by the case of the engineer's thumb in the Sherlock Holmes canon, where Holmes sort of says to Watson, these farmlands breed not discontent but outright malice and murder. And so, hang on, I'm just going to go back to the Hunter's Dream, I think. No, fuck it. So what happened when Gothic fiction went metropolitan was that you had penny dreadfuls and social horror, which were enabled by the fact that people were publishing anthologies and were publishing magazines which would contain individual chapters of a story. Like Dickens published a lot of what he initially wrote as individual chapters, and it was particularly fertile ground in the Victorian era for this sort of stuff because of things like the Abolition of Slavery Act and the Reform Act of, I think it was 1852. I mean, this was a society that was becoming much more aware of the inherent cruelty of metropolitan culture, and particularly of British culture, which had previously seen itself as kind of unassailably moral. And it was during that time that Penny Dreadfuls introduced inherently Gothic characters like Varney the Vampire, who, as much as we like to think of Dracula as the definitive vampire character, for a lot of Victorians it was Varney who was this penny dreadful, sort of much more aristocratic, less violent and bestial than the original depiction of Dracula, who came from the east to corrupt the west and eventually track back there. And so we had this culture where everyone was ready for some pretty stringent, self-reflective commentary on the nature of man and of man's inhumanity to man. And this was kind of much more that was reflected in the popularity of publications like the City Mysteries. So there were the London Mysteries, and there were the New York Mysteries, and the Boston Mysteries, and the Paris Mysteries. Paris itself is kind of this particularly great that's an incredibly lame way of putting it. This particularly fertile ground for Gothic fiction. All you have to do is think about things like Hunchback of Notre Dame and a lot of the other sort of ghost stories that came out around that time to realise that, yeah, this Paris itself, with its sort of Gothic-inspired history and its own histories of revolt and self-reflection, was this great melting pot and this great breeding ground for this sort of stuff. I just want to point out that messenger there, that little messenger statue. You'll see them all the way through the game, and it's just great environmental detail to point out the fact that these things are familiar. They've been around in Yharnam for an awfully long time, and as we'll see as the game progresses, a lot of this stuff is built on prehistory in Yharnam. This is built on, a lot of Yharnam culture is influenced by things that came before, all these precursors. And so a very high proportion of the city in Victorian era England, and this is going to sound morbid, but it's true, was dead. You know, it wasn't the kind of bustling, heterogeneous city it is now, where we have, you know, it's true, some overpopulation problems, but not really that bad. It was a large proportion of the city were those in burial grounds. You know, the ones that we'd had, the ones that had been buried during the plague. Fun little anecdote about that: when they were digging the Piccadilly line, the tube section that runs sort of northeast to southwest in London, they had to go round a certain area, a couple of areas actually, because the ground was so thick with the bodies of plague victims that they physically couldn't tunnel through without all these bodies just kind of falling out. I went to a fantastic exhibition at the Transport Museum that was showing exactly how they would used to bore these tunnels, and these things would just grind through these plague bodies. It was just insane. The fact that this guy is waiting outside this house has always puzzled me. I think, though, it's related to something we're going to talk about in a little bit, that even as people's humanity is eroded by the beast blood, a kernel of it remains. You know, whether that was that guy's home, whether he was waiting for somebody who he knew,
wretched outsider,
whether he was a racist who's just not going to give me the time of day.
Me to open this door. Heavens, the depths of depravity.
All right. So, yeah, so the Victorians had this preoccupation with mortality and this sort of morbid fascination with with ghoulish aspects of it. But at the same time, they were looking to reinforce Gothic morality. They'd seen Gothic architecture and gone, right, well, this is reflective of our moral character. And now they were saying, well, there's a lot to envy about Gothic and ancient Protestant, old Protestant rather, society and cultural mores that we should be celebrating. And so they wanted to prove that Gothic could be more than just decoration. They wanted to prove that it could be integral to the national character. And John Ruskin, for instance, he was a great supporter of that idea. He was very much a fan of the fact that... I'll talk after this.
I don't know your voice, but I know that smell. Are you a hunter? Maybe it's we look for my mum. Daddy never came back from the hunt, and she went to find him, but now she's gone too. I'm all alone and scared.
Yeah,
Really?
I don't know what sort of massive fucking monster you would have to be to refuse that.
Red-jeweled brooch. It's so big and beautiful. You won't miss it.
Why do you talk like salad fingers? I've just realised.
If you find my mum, give her this music box.
Nah.
It plays one of Daddy's favourite songs. And when Daddy
She did.
forgets us, we play it for him so he remembers.
God.
Mum's so silly running off without it.
Has any character ever been more doomed than that mother? Yes, actually, the little girl. But, actually, you know what? I'm going to return to the Hunter's Dream, I think. No. Where did I get Madman's Knowledge? Of course I did. So, Madman's Knowledge, definitely worth talking about. This is the first indication that there is more going on here than just an outbreak of lycanthropy, of werewolfism. Skull of a madman touched by the wisdom of the great ones, used to gain insight. Insight, as Epic Name Bro has pointed out, is probably a pun, or rather the idea that people are trying to get eyes on the inside. is probably a pun on the word insight. Making contact with eldritch wisdom is a blessing, for even if it drives one mad, it allows one to serve a grander purpose for prosperity. Those who are touched by the Great Ones can die, but it leaves a lingering sense effect, a lingering quale in the brain that lets people see some of this shit. Who was swinging? That was terrifying. I just heard somebody swing. Okay. I'm gonna go level up with the Hunter stream, and then we're going to continue talking about the particularly morbid nature of Victoriana. So, they were, towards the sort of mid to late Victorian era, they became obsessed with spirituality. Death was a constant for them. Overpopulated cities, poverty becoming indistinguishable, becoming so endemic to the point where Dickens would spend his entire career railing against it. Charles Dickens, a lot of people don't know this, he spent a lot of his early life growing up in a debtor's prison. Don't fucking die now. I have a question about why I would come this way. Growing up in a debtor's prison because of debts that his father had incurred. And so he was constantly railing against this sort of stuff. He was constantly railing against this inequality in society that saw people treated as commodities, as things to be traded. And you know, it's one of those things that as soon as you know that about Dickens, suddenly everything he writes takes on this incredible air of, you know, of a charity. He really wanted to highlight the plight of these people because he used to be one himself, and I don't think that that's something that he could have done had he not experienced that in his youth. But there was this pervasive and pernicious rather, morbid flavour to everything the Victorians did. So they were obsessed with spirituality and with spirit photography and of mediums, and there are so many examples given out there of famous Victorian mediums who would I just fucking realised something now, right, never mind. Who would full on claim to not apparate, that's a Harry Potter thing, who would claim to be able to manifest, you know, spiritual energy in the form of ectoplasm, which was a physical substance of the sort of nature of, in the same vein as you might think of phlogiston, and sort of people conducted experiments to see if there was, to see if the soul had weight. They would weigh a body before its death, and they would weigh a body after its death, and they would use these like decreasing pounds that would happen, I guess, I don't know why it happened, but as proof of the fact that the soul had left the body and the soul had weight. And the soul having weight is something that FromSoft have touched upon in their other games. So, for instance, they would talk about how, you know, homing soul maps, the spell has weight. The idea that there's a tangible element to spirituality was shot through Victorian culture. Even people who we might think of as the ultimate rationalists, like Arthur Conan Doyle, trying to do this with one hand, sorry, was susceptible to this sort of stuff. He very famously fell for the case of the Cottingley Fairies, where these two girls artfully, very, very cleverly coloured in and sketched and copied illustrations of fairies from various books, and then they stuck them up using clips on furniture and on foliage outside, and managed to convince everybody, even Arthur Conan Doyle, that, you know, fairies were real and that the supernatural, the preternatural, genuinely had a place in our world. And I don't want to insult anybody by, you know, talking about religious beliefs or whatever, but it doesn't. And don't be fucking stupid. So there was this incredible time during the Victorian era where people genuinely would believe this sort of stuff. Then, and you only have to look at their response to things like Jack the Ripper. You know, all the press used to. There was this really famous cartoon embodying him as the spirit of neglect, stalking Whitechapel, killing those people who've been left behind by poverty. So death and poverty, it became inextricably bound in the minds of Victorians, and consequently it led to, among other things, Gothic fiction turning from having monsters who were supernatural to becoming very human characters. And after I talk to the doll, we're going to talk about exactly what that means for Gothic fiction, how the horror of it, the terror, the wonder went from being completely external to internal.